Join with me as we pray. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you for the glory of the heritage of this great state. We thank you for those whose memories are held so high that they're honored today to be inducted into the Women's Hall of Fame. Lord, let this not be wasted on us and on our state. Let this be a time where we're motivated and stirred for the greatness of what can be accomplished. Lord, we thank you that women hold a high place. Lord, let us never, ever try to denigrate anyone by their gender. Give us grace to be honorable. And we just pray that all of this day will honor the name of our Lord. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Good morning. My name is Steve Murray. I'm director here at the Alabama Department of Archives and History, and it's my pleasure to welcome you for this very special ceremony. Could we ask for a more beautiful Alabama day? And does it get any better than Alabama in deep autumn? I think not. We are so honored to have you here with us. We have a wonderful program planned. While you are here, I hope you'll keep in mind that today's events, in addition to being a very important annual ritual for the Alabama Women's Hall of Fame, is part of an ongoing series of commemorative activities associated with the centennial of women's suffrage in our country. We marked the centennial of the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 2020 when we couldn't do much in person together at all, but have had a series of ongoing programs here and around the state to mark that important occasion. While you're here after today's luncheon, I hope you'll take advantage of the opportunity to enjoy two more aspects of that commemoration. One is in our statuary hall right here on the first floor, where we recently unveiled two new additions to that hall, busts of Patty Ruffner Jacobs and Amelia Boynton Robinson, two more of Alabama's accomplished daughters. And upstairs on the second floor is a temporary exhibit called Justice Not Favor, Alabama Women in the Vote, that reviews the story of the long struggle for Alabama women to attain access to the ballot box. First achieved for most white Alabama women by the 19th Amendment, but then a continuing story that took until the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 for all Alabama women, white and black, to be able to exercise their constitutional right to vote. That exhibit will run through May, but we would certainly love to see you upstairs this afternoon after the events here, if you'd like to partake that. Now, after our next musical piece, and I want to thank Mary Claire Johnson on our staff, you will hear from the interim board chair, Cathy Randall. Any of you who have ever served in an administrative capacity or as a board chair know what the word interim means. It comes with uncertainty and challenges almost inevitably. And Dr. Cathy Randall approached the responsibility of being interim chair of this board the same way she does everything else, with a commitment to excellence, commitment to doing the very best that we can to pursue the mission of this organization. And so I know that you will welcome her appropriately when she comes to the podium in a few moments. Thank you again for being here. It's good to see all of you in person.
What a great day in the history of the state of Alabama. I'm Cathy, Randall, Interim Chair of the Alabama Women's Hall of Fame Board of Directors, and on behalf of our wonderful board, what a joy it is to welcome everyone here on this very special day. We have some special introductions to make. What I'd like to do is, as your name is called, if you would please stand and remain standing, and then we can all honor you with our applause at the end. I'd like to start with our state treasurer who dropped in to honor the occasion. He's chairing a board meeting in just a few minutes. But young Boozer, thank you so much for having come. All right. We'll make that one exception for the applause. Steve Murray, our wonderful state archivist. And Steve has asked that we hold our applause till everyone has stood. Margie Malone Tuckson and her husband Reed Tuckson, sister and brother-in-law of our inductee Vivian Malone Jones. UA history professor John Giggy and his student John Pace, nominators of Vivian Malone Jones. U.S. Senator Doug Jones and his wife Louise. Valerie Burns, nominator of Emira Griffin. Lee Davis, Vice President of Alabama Power Company. Rhonda Chambers, Distinguished Chair of the Alabama Women's Hall of Fame Board of Directors through 2020. Beth Poole, former Executive Secretary of the Alabama Women's Hall of Fame. The Reverend John Killian, from whom you've heard. Our Governor's Chief of Staff and soon-to-be President of the University of South Alabama, Joe Bonner. Our Board of Directors members, Patricia Barnes and Jean Vaughn. Clare Keel, President of the Judson College Alumni Association. And staff members of the archives who have been so helpful. Ryan Blocker, Georgia Ann Hudson, Alex Colvin, and Haley Aaron. Will you join me in thanking all of them? Thank you so much. On this, the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the first induction ceremony, the Board of Directors of the Alabama Women's Hall of Fame honors and thanks immensely Judson College for having been the host institution for 50 years. The generous support of the college, the warmth of its hospitality, and the extraordinary expertise and commitment to excellence of its staff contributed vitally to the successful achievement of the mission of the Alabama Women's Hall of Fame, to honor women who have made significant contributions to the state of Alabama and to preserve their memories as inspirations for generations to come. For the last 10 years, Beth Poole has served faithfully, first as Assistant Executive Secretary and then as Executive Secretary from the Judson staff, and in 2021 contributed selflessly in ensuring that the Alabama Women's Hall of Fame would transition securely away from Judson. Her efficiency, effectiveness, and passion for the mission of the Women's Hall of Fame was an enormous gift to the Board of Directors. And on their behalf, Beth, could I ask you to come forward and let us present a resolution to you? Whereas Beth Poole served with distinction as Executive Secretary of the Alabama Women's Hall of Fame for a decade. And whereas she handled all of the logistics for the selection of new honorees. And whereas she arranged flawlessly the induction ceremonies and celebration luncheon. And whereas her dedication to the mission of the Alabama Women's Hall of Fame and her commitment to excellence in all that she did created the success of the Alabama Women's Hall of Fame and ensured it in recognizing the contribution of outstanding Alabama women and preserving their legacy. Now, therefore, be it resolved that the Board of Directors of the Alabama Women's Hall of Fame extends its deepest appreciation to Beth Poole for her priceless contributions to the Alabama Women's Hall of Fame. Beth, thank you so very, very much. State Archivist Steve Murray stepped forward with his formidable expertise to guide and support the Board of Directors through the myriad of decisions that had to be made expeditiously to move the Hall of Fame to safe storage here at the Alabama Department of Archives and History. He also provided invaluable direction through the process of requesting proposals for a new host institution and for making the final decision. His contributions are innumerable, and the Board of Directors would like to ask Steve, although he was reluctant to do so, Steve to come forward and receive this resolution of gratitude. Steve, whereas from the moment of the announcement that the Alabama Women's Hall of Fame would need to identify a new host institution, you stepped forward to ensure that the contents would be preserved, moved, and stored safely, and that the required legislative approval would be secured. And whereas Steve's commitment to preserving Alabama history extended in extraordinary ways to the benefit of the Alabama Women's Hall of Fame, and whereas he dispatched his exceptional staff to supervise the process, including Ryan Blocker, Carrie Halford, Michael Grissett, Charles Busby, Rebecca Jackson, and the extraordinary Haley Aaron. Now, therefore, be it resolved that the Board of Directors of the Alabama Women's Hall of Fame extends deepest appreciation to State Archivist Steve Murray and to his staff. Steve, we'll never be able to thank you enough. Innumerable donations poured in to help with the expenses of safely moving the Hall of Fame contents to the Alabama archives. Special appreciation needs to be paid to the Alabama Power Foundation, Madam Vice President, the Alabama Department of Archives and History, Mr. Archivist, and to the faithful members of the League of Women Voters from around the state who covered the costs of the move. Governor Kay Ivey and Representative Bill Poole worked to identify state funding in support of the Alabama Women's Hall of Fame, assistance that proved prophetic and essential in light of the unexpected need to move. Representative Terry Collins sponsored the resolution drafted by our archivist, enabling this state agency to move forward with the transition. These have made possible the 2021 induction ceremony that you are honoring us with your presence, and also ensured the safe transition of the Alabama Women's Hall of Fame. And now, why we've all come, the induction of the 2021 Giants into the Alabama Women's Hall of Fame. I will ask Dr. Valerie Burns first to come forward and preside over the induction of Amira Frances Griffin. She will be followed after both Valerie and one other person unveil the plaque. Cathy Jones arrived. There you are. Wonderful, Cathy. Cathy Jones, president of the Alabama League of Women Voters. They will unveil her plaque, and then immediately following that, we have the great honor of U.S. Senator Doug Jones, who will induct Vivian Malone Jones, and he and her sister will unveil that plaque. So, Valerie, will you come forward now?
Good morning. It's great to see everyone. Lots of familiar faces. As a Judson College graduate, it is an honor to induct a fellow Judson sister, Amira Frances Griffin. Though I'm saddened that this event is not taking place at our beloved Judson, which was the home of the Alabama Women's Hall of Fame from the organization's founding in 1970 until the school closed in May, the Judson spirit lives on in the lives of the women who have graduated from Judson and those who have been in the neighborhood embraces and nurtures all of those who have walked Judson's hallowed halls. It is wonderful to see so many Judson sisters here today. Amira Frances Griffin was a pioneering suffragette who prepared the way for women to have the right to vote in Alabama. Born in Wetumpka on July 22, 1843, she graduated from the Judson Female Institute in 1860. Though educated to be a wife and mother, Griffin never married, perhaps because so many men her age were killed in the Civil War. Griffin chose one of the few careers available to her and became a teacher, providing the first opportunity she had to speak in public. Though she lived with her widowed sisters, Griffin traveled extensively on her own, giving speeches for social causes, first for prohibition and later for women's suffrage. Many women who worked for suffrage began their social uplift work in other areas, and Griffin was no exception. She began her public work in the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which sought to end the consumption of alcohol due to its negative impacts on children and women. Her activities for prohibition and suffrage, which began in the 1880s, are well documented in newspapers from across Alabama and throughout the nation. One news clipping and advertising a speech Griffin was to give on prohibition in Clanton noted that Griffin is one of the South's brightest and most thoroughly accomplished daughters. She has won the admiration and praise of her hearers wherever she has lectured. After the speech, the editor praised her talk, noting Griffin is not the only Southern woman who has won fame in the lecture field, but she wears the laurel as the greatest and most successful. Griffin was so well known for her prohibition work that she was invited to address the Texas legislature on the importance of including prohibition in the schools. A note about her visit states, when Miss Griffin braved the Texas legislature in order to induce temperance instruction in their schools, a politician arose to prevent the subject from being presented, saying he did not intend the short-haired women of Texas should take possession of the legislature. But when it was at last decided that Miss Griffin should be allowed to address the members, she responded by saying, "I am not short-haired, and God has so favored me that I'm not even a Texan." Prohibition instruction was passed in Texas. In another editorial about her speech, a newspaper editor from North Carolina, of all places, noted that somebody said in Texas last spring, "Well, misfortunes never come singly, and Texas got the legislature, the floods, the smallpox, and Frances Griffin all at once." Griffin and other female crusaders soon realized that without the right to vote, they would never be able to effectively achieve social change. Thus, Griffin moved to the suffrage cause and became a one-woman crusader to bring the right to vote to women in Alabama. The History of Women's Suffrage, published in 1902 by Susan B. Anthony, noted that in 1892, a suffrage club was founded in Verbena by Mrs. Frances Griffin, who has since become noted as a public speaker for the cause. In 1899, Griffin was giving speeches for suffrage throughout the state and the nation. That year, she spoke at the 31st Annual Women's Suffrage Convention in Grand Rapids, Michigan. According to the Grand Rapids Herald, as reprinted in the Montgomery Advertiser, the address delivered by Frances Griffin of Alabama came as a surprise to nearly all who were present. For some reason, the name of Miss Griffin was not as prominent in the association as some others, and when she opened a whole battery of wit, sarcasm, and brilliancy upon the audience, the effect was electrifying. Miss Griffin is a native of Alabama. She has a strong, well-built figure and an irresistible magnetism. Her enunciation and delivery were fascinating. She was interrupted frequently, and it was often some moments before the laughter and applause subsided sufficiently for her to proceed. Griffin was recalled for an encore speech. But the most important speech of Griffin's suffrage work and her career was given on Monday, June 10th, 1901, when Frances Griffin addressed the 1901 Alabama Constitutional Convention. Griffin, in her follow-up summary about the talk, noted that she had only found out on that Saturday that she would be speaking that Monday. In an age before social media, television, and even radio, word still spread quickly, and the gallery in the Capitol was packed with women dressed in white wearing their yellow suffrage sashes. The transcripts of the proceedings and the flood of articles and editorials on her address provide a candid snapshot of Griffin's personality, the state of affairs of white women in Alabama in 1901, and the work of the Constitutional Convention. Griffin was ushered in after a motion to adjourn for the day had been made. Several motions had to be withdrawn, and then a motion had to be made to suspend the rules in order for Griffin to speak. Many delegates gave a no voice vote to prohibit Griffin from speaking, but when it came time to actually stand up and be counted by a show of hands, the body voted 71-1 in favor of allowing Griffin to speak. When questioned later as to why those who initially said no refused to be counted in the visible hand vote, the delegates admitted that they were afraid of the large crowd of women in the gallery. Mr. Burns of Dallas County was the lone delegate to have his negative vote counted by hand. The chair of the convention, John Knox, appointed General Sanford, who had made the motion to hear from Griffin, and Mr. Wilson from Washington County, and that same Mr. Burns of Dallas County to conduct Frances Griffin to the platform to speak. The appointment of Burns, the sole objector to her speaking, brought laughter from the other delegates. According to one article, Griffin spoke from the president's desk. She was not even given the courtesy to speak from the main podium, but she spoke to a standing room only crowd. Griffin's speech to the Constitutional Convention bears witness to the wit, humor, and logic so often mentioned in news articles. She tackles each of the reasons given for why women should not be allowed to vote with the following points. Addressing the need for women to have the vote, Griffin states, "Nobody denies that women are the chief moral agencies of the world today, nor that they walk in the front ranks of the small army that is working to lift the world to better things. But they need more to effect their purpose. She has found out if you want your program accepted, there is no better way than to have a vote. The thickest-skinned legislator is sensitive to the opinions of a voter." And then it says in parentheses in the transcript, laughter from the audience. Regarding the idea of silent influence, Griffin points out the hypocrisy of the point, stating, "This old foolishness about a vote lessening our silent influence is proven up. Did you ever hear of a man who wanted to be disfranchised in order to increase his influence? I have found that the silent influence is a little too silent in the ears of our legislator." Discussing the notion that politics is too corrupt for women, Griffin takes men to task for raising such a subject, stating, "Politics is what men have made it. Government may be divided into 4 departments: state, society, church, and home. The state is the only one from which women have been excluded. The other 3 have been maintained to the highest standard, but the first has become so corrupt that it is not fit for women. Of course it is corrupt, but it's because women have been kept out. If men alone had tried to manage all 4 departments, they would, by this time, all have been demoralized." She then goes on to add that women have a trust in religion and no politics, while men have a trust in politics and, judging by the state of public affairs, no religion to speak of. And in response to the assertion that women are not smart enough to vote, Griffin asked, "Do women know enough about politics to vote intelligently?" And this elicited laughter from the delegates. She said, "I see you don't need the answer, but I'll give it to you because I have it." Griffin points out that women have a higher literacy rate than men, and 55% of students in secondary and higher education are women. She then delivers one of the best lines of her speech when she states, "Women neither steep themselves in tobacco nor besot themselves with liquor, so that whatever brains they have are kept intact." Griffin contradicts the assertion that women should not vote because they cannot be soldiers by pointing out that many men often assert that those who cannot help to enforce the law shall not help choose lawmakers. But this is not so. The United States military statistics taken at the time of our Civil War showed that a large majority of doctors, lawyers, ministers, and educators examined for military duty were found to be physically disqualified. Since professional men as a class cannot fight while unskilled laborers can, does it follow that suffrage should be taken away from professional men and be limited to unskilled workers? The old, the infirm, the halt, the lame, and the blind are freely admitted to vote. So find some other reason for excluding women from the fact that they do not, other than the fact that they do not fight. The force of this statement was especially poignant since the Constitutional Convention delegates consisted of doctors, lawyers, businessmen, educators, and other professionals, the same people who would not have been fit to fight in the Civil War. Addressing the notion that men should not place the burden of politics on women, Griffin states, far from increase the burden on women, it would lessen it. The immense work in which women engage in charities and reforms and the constant repairing of the damages of society would be infinitely less if they had some power to prevent the evil in the first place. They are shut out from all influence over causes and only permitted to deal with the results of pauperism and crime, but they are forbidden all part in the making and administering of laws and shaping conditions that would lessen the number of paupers and criminals to begin with. To counter that the notion that not all women want the vote, Griffin makes the argument, but rights are not measured by the number of people who want them. So long as there is one woman who wants the right to vote, she is, according to the spirit of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, entitled to that right. She continues, if the gallery were not so packed with women today, you might still say women did not want to vote. But if one man or woman wants the right to vote, what earthly reason is there for denying it? Simply because other men and women do not wish to exercise it. And she closed her speech by saying, we do not ask the ballot because we do not believe in men or because we think men unjust or unfair. We do not ask to speak for ourselves because we believe men unwilling to speak for us, but because men by their very nature cannot speak for women. So long as laws affect both men and women, then both men and women together should make those laws. And then she says, why don't you applaud that? Women need the ballot not because men are sinners, although you know they are, but because they are by nature different from women, too different to be able to represent them, and thus women must either go unrepresented or represent themselves. With the conclusion of her speech, Frances Griffin became the first woman to address a legislative body in Alabama. The convention voted against giving women the right to vote via the 1901 Constitution, though later in the proceedings, women did gain the right to vote on municipal tax questions. Less than 24 hours after that law was passed, however, it was rescinded as well. Griffin continued her suffrage work, including serving as president of the Alabama Women's Suffrage Association and doing most of the work for the organization in 1903 and 04. She wrote articles about suffrage, which appeared in various newspapers throughout the state, including a 1903 article examining her 20 years of public welfare work. She lived to see the revitalization of the suffrage movement in Alabama with the creation of the Alabama Equal Suffrage Association, provided over by Patty Ruffner Jacobs in 1912. By that time, Griffin had scaled back her work, leaving it to the next generation, though she did attend the February 1917 AESA convention in Birmingham, where she was the oldest suffragist in attendance. Griffin saw the AESA work in vain for a suffrage vote from the Alabama legislature in 1915. Frances Griffin passed away on June 17, 1917 in Bessemer after a brief illness. Newspaper notices of her death discussed her teaching career, her work for Prohibition, and her suffrage work, noting that she spoke 6 languages, traveled extensively, and had many friends who truly appreciated her noble character and greatly admired her splendid intellect. She was an earnest worker in all of the big things of life, and long will her example live in the hearts of many who grieve her going from among us. Emma Frances Griffin, tireless campaigner for a woman's right to vote, never cast a ballot. The 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote, was declared ratified on August 26, 1920. Thank you. Emma Frances Griffin, pioneering suffragist and the first woman to address a legislative body in the state of Alabama. She spoke 6 languages and traveled extensively, speaking on behalf of women's rights. She died before the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote, was ratified in 1920.
Well, thank you. It is truly an honor for me to be here. Cathy, thank you so much for inviting me to be here. Cathy, Randall, and I go back farther than we both want to remember, but I'm just glad we still can remember it. It is truly, though, an honor for me to be with such distinguished guests, Marjorie and Reed, Vivian's sister and brother-in-law, a lot of old friends out in this audience, including my friend Peggy Wallace Kennedy and her husband Mark. How appropriate that you are here for the induction of Vivian Malone Jones into the Alabama Women's Hall of Fame. We all know that story well, the story of what has become known as the stand in the schoolhouse door. Now, sadly, Alabama seems to always lean toward glorifying an act of defiance on the wrong side of history rather than the courage of being on the right side of history. But today, we honor the life and legacy of one who dared to be on the right side of history throughout her life. Today, we focus in part not on a defiant stand, but on what history should record as the walk through a schoolhouse door. Vivian was born in 1942, the fourth of 8 children. She grew up in Mobile, where her parents were active in the civil rights movement and taught her the value of an education. She attended Central High School and received a bachelor's degree from Alabama A&M, which was unaccredited at the time. But she wanted an accounting degree, one that was not offered at A&M. So she set her sights on the University of Alabama. She wanted that accounting degree, but she also wanted to continue efforts to desegregate the University of Alabama in the early 1960s. It took a lawsuit, filing a lawsuit, as it happened in so many places throughout the country, not just in the South. It took lawsuits to desegregate schools. Finally, in a lawsuit filed on her behalf by the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Alabama ruled that the practice of denying admission to black students was a constitutional violation of the court's 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision, thus setting the stage for Governor Wallace's defiant stand in June of 1963. With TV cameras rolling, camera shutters clicking, Governor Wallace stood his ground, at least for a time. At Foster Auditorium, Tuscaloosa, Alabama, despite repeated requests to step aside by Deputy Attorney General Nicholas Katzenbach and federal marshals, Governor Wallace stood his ground until President Kennedy federalized the National Guard, and the commanding general of the Alabama National Guard made the request, and Governor Wallace retreated. A short time later, Vivian Malone Jones, escorted by at least 100 Alabama National Guardsmen, entered Foster Auditorium and registered as a junior at the University of Alabama. Imagine, folks, just imagine a 21-year-old female, not to mention the fact that she was black, 21-year-old female having to be escorted to college classes by 100 members of the military. That, ladies and gentlemen, is why June 11th, 1963 in Tuscaloosa, Alabama should be remembered as the walk through the schoolhouse door, not the stand. But for me, the remarkable part of this history, the part that truly captures Vivian's courage and determination, was not the walk, not her enrollment, but the fact that she remained. She remained at the University of Alabama for another 2 years, ultimately receiving a degree, a Bachelor of Arts in Business Administration, becoming the first black student to graduate from the University of Alabama. It is hard to imagine what her time at the capstone was like in those days. I know it was a far different life than what I experienced just about a decade later, or that Cathy experienced, and so many of you experienced. It's hard to imagine, but as the saying goes, she persisted, And that is perhaps the greatest testament of the character of Vivian Malone Jones. Vivian would later receive a master's degree from George Washington University while working at the Department of Justice and then at the Veterans Administration. In 1977, she was tapped to lead the Voter Education Project, succeeding John Lewis as its executive director. When preparing these remarks, I called Vivian's sister, Sharon, who I've known for many years, to talk about what it was that Sharon might want me to say about Vivian that folks might not really focus on or know. Without hesitation, she said that it was Vivian's passion for voting rights, a passion that she displayed throughout her life, a passion instilled by her family, particularly her uncle, Joe Malone, who made it his mission to see to it that all of his nieces and nephews got their driver's license and registered to vote. With the Voter Education Project, she piloted a program known as Project 23 to help address the barriers that black citizens in Georgia saw when they tried to vote. Her work on voting rights often gets overlooked in her life's work. But in her time with Project 23, she registered over 3 million black voters. And she remains steadfast in her commitment to what she describes as the sacred right to vote until her death in 2005. Vivian moved to the Environmental Protection Agency as the Director of Civil Rights and Urban Affairs and as Director of Environmental Justice. In 2014, the EPA established the Vivian Malone's Legacy Award in her honor. The award is presented to an individual who has demonstrated integrity and consistently contributed to the social justice in the EPA or greater community. But in discussing this occasion with Sharon, we both knew there would be a program that you could read, that you would generally know so much. We both agreed that being true to her spirit, Vivian would not want words just spoken about her, but also for her. What would Vivian Malone Jones say today in this body if she had the opportunity? Vivian was a gracious woman, gracious when she walked through the schoolhouse door, gracious as a student, gracious in her professional life, gracious when she received the first Lurleen Wallace Award for Courage from the Wallace family. And she would, of course, be gracious today, thanking her family, thanking all of those, thanking the Hall of Fame, thanking all of those who made this induction and this honor possible. But Vivian was also fond of saying, you must always be ready to seize the moment. This would be a moment for Vivian, and I believe she would see this ceremony as an opportunity to seize that moment, an opportunity to celebrate, but also an opportunity to frankly express some disappointment and dismay, an opportunity to challenge each of us to do better. She would most assuredly be disappointed that America continues to struggle with issues of race, that race continues to be more of a matter of partisan politics than of equality, of equity, of fairness, of justice, and of simple right and wrong. Today, our schools are being resegregated. Voting rights and access to the ballot are under assault to the point that if she were alive, I am absolutely convinced she would be resurrecting Project 23 in Georgia and trying to expand it nationwide. Vivian devoted so much of her life to equality in education and voting rights, and in her lifetime, great strides were made. But since her death in 2005, we have to admit that America has been somewhat backsliding on issues of race, despite the fact that America elected its first black president, or perhaps because of it. Today, Vivian would note with a sense of sadness that just now, as we meet today, as we're meeting right here today, racist language is finally being removed from the 1901 Alabama Constitution, 120 years after it was adopted. She would note with a sense of irony, with all due respect to the archives, she would note in a sense of irony that today's ceremony is taking place in a building that houses the state archives, ironic because it was just 17 months ago, in June of 2020, 119 years after the archives were formed. The Alabama Department of Archives and History acknowledged its own racist past, that it was founded in part to preserve the Southern notion of white supremacy and to promote the lost cause of the Confederacy as something that was noble instead of the historically accurate description that it was traitorous and immoral. Vivian would know that systemic racism remains a reality in American society, despite the belief in racial equality on the part of most individuals. That historically our governments, our economy, and many private institutions seeded or perpetuated discrimination against racial minorities to the political, economic, and social advantage of whites. She would know that the decline of overt bigotry in mainstream society has not erased the legacies of blatantly racist systems that operated for hundreds of years. And by the way, ladies and gentlemen, that's not Vivian words. That's not my words. But that's the words of the Alabama Department of Archives and History on June 23rd, 2020, when it recommitted itself, to their credit, recommitted to truth, to history as it truly was, no matter how difficult it might be to face. In her gracious way, Vivian would thank and commend the archives for that recommitment to an accurate history. There is no question that she would be so proud of that. But I would have to say she would also kind of shake her head in disbelief. She would shake her head in disbelief about how the state of Alabama continues to seem to perpetuate the myth of the lost cause by protecting monuments to the Confederacy, a government that sought to preserve America's original sin of slavery, and how the state has effectively chilled teachers in our schools from teaching about race and an accurate portrayal of history by banning a theory that has never been taught in our schools, and frankly, whose critics can't really even explain what it is. And I'm absolutely convinced that she'd look out over this audience today with eyes moistened by tears shed from the death of so many unarmed black men in this country. And she would look each of you in the eye. She would look each of you one at a time if necessary and say, folks, it is true that all lives matter. But until each of you can say, until society as a whole can say, black lives matter, specifically black lives, and mean it, we can never live up to the promise, the idea that is America. That's what Vivian Malone Jones would do and say here today. 58 years ago, Vivian Malone Jones took the walk through the schoolhouse door. We can best honor her by acknowledging that while most doors are unlocked today, they are still heavy. They are still heavy and so hard to open for so many people in our society, in Alabama and in the rest of the nation. Let us commit ourselves today with this honor for Vivian to do our part to open those doors as wide as possible so that everyone, regardless of who they are, regardless of their race, the religion, or the zip code that they live in, can walk through the same doors that Vivian walked so long ago. Thank you. This plaque reads, Vivian Malone Jones, the first African American to graduate from the University of Alabama in 1965. She graduated with honors and later fought for equality and justice through her professional work, while living a life based on core values of education, service, and faith.
On behalf of the Alabama Women's Hall of Fame and every individual here who was blessed to hear these remarks, I want to thank you for coming. Thank you for honoring these giants in the history of the state of Alabama. And a special thanks to Senator Jones and Dr. Burns for the inspiration that you gave us by encapsulating the tremendous courage of these women whose memory we will preserve in the Alabama Women's Hall of Fame for generations to come. After our wonderful Haley Aaron comes forward to lead us all in the state song, I would like to invite everyone who let the archives know you'd like to have lunch with us today to come and join us. And once again, thank you very, very much for being a part of the 50th installation ceremony of the Alabama Women's Hall of Fame. Will you all rise as Haley leads us in the state song?